Good morning, everyone. This is Jason Dean live coming at you at Film Fanatic headquarters. Happy Friday, TGIF. It's about quarter after 10 here on a Friday, chilly morning. Week or so after Thanksgiving, and it's here we are in December. So hope everyone's doing good. Thanks again, everybody supporting. Just had a couple more videos reach the range of about 1,000 views. So it's been really cool. I've been really surprised by certain films that have been getting the amount of traction that they've been getting. It seems to be the weird trend, which is great and awesome, but super surprising is the trend seems to be the films that are the most obscure films that I have, on my channel, have been getting the most hits, which is so surprising. Like they're actually outperforming, or yeah, they're overperforming, or there's more of a degree of attraction to those videos for these like really underground films as opposed to like the bigger Hollywood films that I've been doing, such as like the Batman or the Avenger movies. It's been really a cool surprise. But what I'm trying to do with this show and this channel, again, it's always about trying to bring light to films that are pretty obscure, and films that I really love, films that I've seen when I was a kid, a lot of new films that I've just discovered in those respective genres. And I try to always mix things up. I try to add some new flavors. I have pretty eclectic tastes. I like to think I have a pretty open mind to different forms of film and art in general. I'm always trying to seek out that next new thing that really, kind of sparks a fire in me, and that kind of inspires me. So it's always about this channel's always about the films. And if somebody out there was one film I did a coverage of, which is one of my favorite kind of underground grindhouse movies, uh, Private Parts, and that's a film that's super super obscure, and I don't think a lot of people know of that film. And I was really surprised the reactions that film got, and some people had commented on that review, and basically they just were like, what the fuck, what WTF. That was their reaction to the film, because it's a pretty, like, that movie in particular, Private Parts, is just an incredibly strange, bizarre movie. And it's like a black comedy essentially, but it's also deals with this whole like psychosexuality kind of element, and it's so great, and it's so disturbing and weird. And that's the at the heart of the whole. That's really the core, the heartbeat of this channel, is to, like, maybe bring movies like that to the forefront. And maybe there's some folks out there in the world that, if they like some strange stuff, they're open to checking out some strange new films or older films. Maybe that would be, the thing for them. So that's what it's about. And so I really appreciate people, checking out all these new things. And I'm always trying to bring variety also. I did a show where I just focused on doing coverage of soundtracks, film score stuff, and how that's like a real deep inspiration for me personally and also musically for my band Quantum. Very much so, everything about, 95% of that band, the influences are from film. And there's the obvious aside from that, or to the side of that, there's the obvious, just, music influences. And it was an interesting thing, because going back to that, and dealing and talking a little bit about that subject for a few minutes here, it was an interesting thing because, in my experience that I've had with like certain kinds of bands and certain kinds of projects, things like personally for me, and also the groups that the various bands I'd been playing with at the time, and this is probably, maybe 7 to 10 years ago or so now. Most of the projects that I was doing up until that point were essentially cover bands and cover, projects that were pickup gigs where I would get, last minute calls to fill in for maybe the drummer in that band who was couldn't do a particular gig, or somebody was putting together a, like they were basically putting together a band for a special event, for like a party or for some kind of a gig, or maybe it's a singer songwriter who wanted to try putting together a full band for a particular gig. So it wasn't necessarily a regular like living breathing entity of a band. It was like more of a project thing. And then also like, where you do the pickup gigs, a lot of the times there's not time for rehearsal, so it's kind of like to a degree of rehearsal also during the gig. And after I kind of things changed for me and I started doing more original based projects, I started doing these other bands that were in various genres where I was moving towards doing all original based stuff. I found myself personally, being more satisfied and more challenged by, creating in any form or capacity original content or being involved with those kinds of projects. And I just found that really fulfilling and even more challenging and worth the extra time and effort and focus that a lot of the time that really requires, because at the end of the day that artist is, essentially leaving that calling card as to like what represents them. So, and during that time I was writing a lot of material, and there were certain projects that I was involved in. One band in particular, People of Earth, was one band I was playing with a lot. That was with my great friend and bass player in Quantum. And that band was primarily moving into a direction of kind of in the style of like Talking Heads. It had a very 80s sound, but it was very 80s centric. And it had a rock feel. And there was other genres in that style. We did some reggae and some other things, but and the other bands were like had the other projects was involved in had also like more of a specific kind of sound, whether it was like a jazz based kind of thing, or maybe more of a jazz fusion oriented kind of style. But they more or less had these like specific styles. And when I started writing for Quantum, I realized that, well, okay, genre, like I kind of look at it as like a genre appropriation. Like certain songs, certain things are not gonna bring, are not gonna really work in the context of a certain band. Like music that I was writing at the time, which was more electronic based, wasn't gonna really lend itself to say work within, this jazz project I was playing in, or say this more 80s sounding kind of group. It wasn't gonna really work, in the context of that. So that pushed me more and more into that space of writing more material for just what I was doing with Quantum. But then over the years with Quantum, like I've gotten more into, and usually around my daily practice or my general focus is to focus more and more on songwriting. That's usually my priority. But I noticed I started to, and I've always had these tastes, but I had all of these influences, that were non-electronic. I had, really big influences from Miles Davis, lots of different jazz albums that I love and cherish, and then also lots of fusion music, and also some world music, classic funk music from like the '60s and '70s, and then the obvious movie influence soundtracks. And I tried to gear, like overall, I would say it's safe to say that I'm not a big fan of labels and all those things, but we that's kind of how we are as a species. We like to have things labeled, and sometimes it's a good thing, and then it's a bad thing. But generally, I look at that band as, it comfortably fits under that label of electronic music. But I started to branch out where I was like writing music that had other elements of non-electronic music. Some funk, some jazz influenced music, some world music. I started to have lots of different influences, and I tried to move the band to a direction, or open up the capacity to that group, to where I could have many different influences, and it wasn't something that could not be appropriate for that genre. So that's kind of where it evolved to, where now I feel like I have more of a jazz influence at times. There's world music. There's, for a while I was doing, years back, I was doing lots of music for dance studios, and so I was doing a lot of percussion oriented rhythms, West African rhythms. And so I've gone back to that a little bit, and I've tried to incorporate those kinds of things into the music for Quantum. So I've tried to make it more broad, whether or not it's success, that's open to interpretation. But I feel like for me, I broadened that palette. And also like rock music, bands like, say the Pixies or Sonic Youth, or anything that's on the experimental side. T Rex is another band. Weezer is another rock band that I really love. I've tried to incorporate more of those influences into the music. So I've tried to broaden the whole kind of template or the palette of the band. So it's obviously electronic music, but tried to dump in more influences so it's more broad, and I don't feel like genre wise I don't have any limitations, or stylistically I can bring other styles into the fold of that band, and and I feel like I reach a point where it kind of makes sense and it feels organic. But primarily, the whole thing with film, the whole thing with the film influence, that's still like the majority of the influence. So I did a show a few days ago where I just talked about film scores, soundtracks, and composers that I really love, and also films that I really love that are like a constant source of inspiration. So I'm trying to do some things on this channel where I'm trying to bring a variety kind of thing and make some specialty shows where I'm focusing on more or less one or two topics. It's all related to film, obviously, but that's kind of what the whole gist of it is. And I always, talk about some music things that are also related to that, particularly with Quantum. But today's show, I'm really excited about. This is a movie I saw. Again, a lot of these films I've seen, I had seen basically growing up, in the days of the VHS craze, and also, a lot of these great, strange exploitation movies at one point were on cable and like syndication. And a lot of these films I remember were in constant rotation on cable. The biggest one for me, which I've done a show on, and it's my favorite film in this style, like the exploitation world, is Tourist Trap. That was a movie that was an integral part of my youth, and that was always something I remember seeing on television. That was a movie that was not. They had set out. The filmmakers had set that film out for a theatrical release, and it's a horror movie, but for some reason it could not get an R rating, so it didn't get that kind of distribution. It ended up getting a PG rating. So over a couple of years, they were able to land a deal through syndication through television, and so that film was put on rotation basically on cable. So millions of kids saw that film, and it disturbed them like it did me. And to me, that's just amazing because the content of that film, there's not really a lot of gore or violence, but it's just it's a at one on one hand it's a really terrible cheesy movie, but it's also like incredibly disturbing and eerie and creepy as all hell. And to see that film was, on cable, like on Saturday mornings, when I was a kid, and getting to see that film all the time, is mind blowing to me. When I recently bought it, well, a few years ago I bought it on Blu-ray, and I've done a show. I did a show on this channel about that film. So this is a film, Grizzly, 1976. Another amazing example of what I feel is it well another prime example of what I feel is pure exploitation. This movie, like the last film I did a film review on The Car, which is also one of my favorite exploitation movies. Also, and again, another film that I used to see as a kid all the time on cable and in VHS. That movie was also very much modeled off of Steven Spielberg's Jaws. Basically, it ripped it off. This film also is another, so there's like kind of a theme here with these last two shows. This film is also a completely, it completely rips off, and it's a complete exploitation knockoff film of Jaws. It even says in the ad for like when they had the big ad campaign, and there's also posters available for Grizzly where it says Jaws with claws. It actually says it on the artwork, and it's hilarious and amazing. This film was a huge, and this is like definitely a in comparison to Steven Spielberg's Jaws, this is ultra low budget. It's really I kind of feel it's definitely like a grindhouse film. It's definitely dirtier. It doesn't have the highbrow caliber style of acting or script writing, but it's still so damn entertaining. It's got this incredible cheese factor to it, but it's a really great story, and it's at the same time it does its own thing, but it's at the same but on the other side of the coin, it's completely unoriginal. But it's super campy, it's super entertaining. And the other thing about this film is it's super gory. Like there's some pretty gnarly kills in this film. And there's a couple of scenes in it that are pretty disturbing. But literally it's similar to The Car, the last movie I did a video on, because there are scenes in Grizzly that where they literally rip off or copy certain scenes from Steven Spielberg's classic The Jaws, which I just think is hilarious. But it comes out in its own way. It's a way. It's a lot more. Jaws, I felt like. I mean, it's such one of the greatest horror movies ever made, and I just think it's easily one of the best movies that Steven Spielberg's ever done, and I love that movie to death. And that's a movie I haven't seen in a long time, and I've been craving to see it again. I don't own it on Blu-ray, but that's a must-have. The other film of his that I love, that might be my favorite Steven Spielberg movie, is Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I do have that. I have a really sweet collector's edition of that movie, and I will definitely be doing a show on that one. That's probably my favorite Spielberg film. But Jaws is, iconic. But the thing that's different, the tonality of it, is that it's a really serious movie. It's serious, and it's got a little bit of humor at times to it, and it's got some great characters. It's a really great story. It's very scary. It's very terrifying, very dark, and it really had left an imprint on society at that time. It made people literally afraid to go swimming in the ocean, and I think that still has carried over. But with this film, Grizzly, obviously it's a total ripoff and knockoff, and they tried to, the filmmakers and the company that was responsible for Grizzly, they tried, they wanted to milk that audience and capitalize on the audience, which is kind of the whole point of the world of exploitation, where they're not necessarily making a film that could be considered, high art. They're not like, they don't necessarily have a social agenda. They don't even take themselves that seriously, but they're in the world of trying to be entertainers and realizing that there's people out there that want to be entertained and have a film that has some copious amounts of blood and violence, but be taken on a ride. I did a show recently on Blood Feast. Herschel Gordon Lewis, one of my favorite directors, kind of the master of exploitation. I mean, there's a really awesome interview with him and Dave Friedman, who was his producer. He also Herschel Gordon Lewis and Dave Friedman worked together for many years, and they put out a whole series of all of these amazing horror exploitation movies. And on the bonus disc of Blood Feast, there's a really awesome interview with Dave Friedman and Herschel Gordon Lewis, and it's really super interesting. It's super fascinating. It's like an 18-minute interview, and they basically talk about, like, the guy who's doing the interview basically asks him, like, so how do you define, exploitation, and, like, do you think of yourself as an artist? And they basically both answer the questions in their own way, but they mostly say how they feel that there should be room, in the context of, say, variety, or people who love big, huge budget Hollywood films, and then people who like small little, sleazy films. There should be, a full openness and capability for films like, a film like, say, E.T., or a film like a pornography film, or Dave Friedman uses as an example, like a film like, some big budget Hollywood film, like, E.T. or something, but then he said, well, there should be also room for a film like, Deep Throat. So and the powers that be shouldn't dictate, you know, uh, what is good, or what should not be shown, or what should not be made. And they were very much about that whole thing of, like, where they ran into lots of controversy because their background, and they were making all of these sleazy nudie movies for a long time, the sex exploitation movies. Then they moved into horror, but they were kind of pushing the envelope of doing these things that were, like, you know, to a degree, like Dave Friedman looked at the work that they did together as, like, they're in the business of the, how he calls it, they're in the business of the forbidden fruit, and usually the forbidden fruit tastes the best, or tastes the sweetest. And I thought that was a cool analogy. But the whole thing about exploitation is that they're not necessarily about, they don't have a social agenda. They're not waving flags for some kind of cause. They're not trying to leave some giant, artistic statement. They're in the mood. They're in the business of, they're trying to entertain people, and that's really it. They realize that there's a small group of people out there, or a large group of people, who are entertained by these kinds of things. So they're making that work for those people. And but they also felt that, well, maybe because they've created so many films, and there's kind of a legacy, as bizarre as it is, they've kind of created a legacy, and to a degree, people could look back at that as a form of art. So it's very interesting. And Grizzly is definitely part of that entire canon. It definitely, it works in that same, or is focused on that same demographic. And it came out in 1976, which is wild. Like, I saw this film a bunch of times when I was a kid, and then I recently bought this on Blu-ray, and this transfer is killer. It's got hours of special features. And there's all kinds of really great interviews, and just, it's fascinating. The transfer of this on Blu-ray with the new picture, or the picture, and the sound is just incredible. It was directed by William Girdler, and he was a pretty well respected director in the world of exploitation. He made this other really tremendous movie that I've done a review on, called Day of the Animals, which is just such an awesome movie that stars Leslie Nielsen. That's going to be a movie that I'm going to eventually cover. But William Girdler was a pretty wild character. He made some, horror exploitation movies. He made lots of variety of different genres or styles in his early part of his career, like Grizzly, 1976, The Manitou, Day of the Day of the Animals. He made this. He also worked. he also worked in the world of black exploitation. He worked with Pam Grier. Pam Grier is kind of known as like the queen of the black exploitation world. All the films that came out in the late '60s, early '70s. He made this Exorcist knockup, which I have not seen, and I really, really want to get it. But he made this Exorcist knockoff, and it was a film that was an exploitation of The Exorcist called Abby, which was a basically a possession movie, but it was a black exploitation movie, and it just looks amazing. He also made this other movie, Sheba Baby, in '75, starring Pam Grier, and I haven't seen that either. And then his one of his earlier films that he made was a kind of this really sleazy grindhouse movie, horror movie called Three on a Meat Hook, and that came out in 1972. And he also made this other film, Asylum of Satan. So he's like done the whole horror thing. He's made black exploitation. He also had worked in the sex exploitation films. And he died really young, unfortunately. But he had a pretty cool career. Grizzly, this film was a huge success. This was probably the biggest of his career, and this was one of the last films that he did. I believe it might have been the last film that he had directed. Um, and this film had, as far as I know, like, and from what I've read about it, had a huge distribution. Had like a national or international distribution, and it was a commercial hit. And it was produced by Edward Montaro. He was an American film producer, and he specialized in distributing and releasing exploitation films and B movies during the '70s and '80s. And his company was called Film Ventures International. And Edward Montaro was a real pivotal guy during this period because he helped finance and put out all of these super low budget strange films and strange films. He also was a real strange, incredible guy. He lost a lot of money through his company at the end of his career, more or less to the end of at the tail end of his career, and he just kind of disappeared. And nobody knew what happened to him, and he just basically checked out and left, and he got out of the business and disappeared, and he had owed people a lot of money and just was a pretty shisty character. He produced films like Getting It to Heaven, Day of the Animals, which I mentioned, this film here, Grizzly, The Dark, Kill and Kill Again, which came out in 1981, Who Are You, which came out in '74, and another film, Great White, which was another Jaws knockoff. Just so many films that he worked on. It's just crazy. Who Are You in 1974, Secret Fantasy in '71, Shock 1977, Mortuary, Boot Hill. I mean, his company just cranked out all these movies, and it's just amazing. He also worked on Pieces, which I did a review on, which is this amazing slasher film, the Spanish slasher film. The Visitor, 1978. Torchlight in '85. Cardiac Arrest in 1980. I mean, the list is endless. So, he definitely, even though he had a reputation as being this, kind of shisty, you know, uh, character in the industry, and apparently he owed people lots of money. He did make a lot of money at one point for his company, and with all of these debts, he just basically got out of the business and exited the business altogether. So but he definitely left a legacy. He definitely was, you know, as a producer, and especially in the world of all things exploitation. Like, he did so much work for so many of these films. It's kind of astounding. So it's kind of easily to think, it's an easy thing to think that he he would have, the world of exploitation in the 60s, 70s, and 80s would be probably quite a bit different, and with his company that he had, Film Ventures International. And there's like I said, there's some really great documentaries on here that are just super fascinating, where they talk about Ed Montaro, and also they really go into William Girdler's career. But this is a tremendous movie. It's super cheesy. It's so terrible, but it's just amazing. And it does has aspects of the film. There's aspects of the film where I feel it does have like this highbrow quality. Like the cinematography is really great. It looks, even though the film was shot for such little money, it does have this high level caliber to it, where like the cinematography, it feels like a much bigger movie than it is. And I think that was attributed to like the use of some real creative ideas on the big screen, and the creative force behind the film, and they were able to get a lot of stuff on film and get a lot of great footage for not having very much time or resources. That's the other thing that I love about this whole world of exploitation, is these, a lot of these filmmakers and filmmakers involved in the exploitation world, they were, they had very limited sources. Their funds were not, the wells were not deep there as far as finance. So they really had to, kind of hustle and scramble and do things quickly and churn things out. And there wasn't the luxury of doing numerous takes of different scenes and other things. And so they were kind of always under the gun. And I kind of feel like that added a quality to these films, of where, their passion is there. They're doing it. There's not, there's not any BS around what they're trying to do. They're just doing it, and it has a guerrilla style quality to it because of the idea of, well, we got to get this done. We don't have all, we don't have all of these resources financially to keep doing this film, or to keep, have a scene that's going to require us to do 100 takes. So, yeah, I can't say enough about this, but this is one of the best exploitation movies around. It's hard to believe it's from 1976. It's just wild. And this film feels really new. It feels like it came out this year in a lot of ways. Even though it does have that dated quality to it, obviously, it's still, but I think that's part of the charm. But on a level where there's barely any budget, and the limitations, they really give you, I get the scope, the sense that the scope was actually kind of a big budget movie. But fabulous movie, Grizzly, 1976, directed by William Girdler. Definitely check this out. So thanks again. This is Jason Dean, and if you get a chance, please like and subscribe to my channel. And we will see you next time. Peace.